Hi everyone. In this chapter, we're going to go through the basics of Ziva Dynamics, and we're going to do it by building a quick ARM rig or ARM simulation rig using this asset. For this chapter, all the project files will be provided, and we're going to start with this ARM setup version 1 rig file. If you open that file, you're going to see pretty much this. And what we have is a quick ARM rig that I've made with some proxy geo, bone geometry, and some muscle geometry. And we're going to build a Ziva simulation rig based off of this asset. So if we go back into the bone mode, you can see it's a simple IKFK rig. And we're going to use this to create some kind of animation, and we're going to constrain our muscle geometry to the rig itself. And for our simulation geometry, if you go under the root and find the model group, we have an additional fat and skin geometry. Well, I'm not going to guide you through the process of creating this geometry in this chapter, but we're going to just use it to build our first setup. Alright, so first things first, let's get rid of all the NURBS curves that are there in my scene, and I'm also going to get rid of all the joints and OK handles, so I'm just dealing with the geometry directly. I'm also going to get the bone model out of reference mode so they're selectable. Let's bring the muscle geometry as well and get that out of reference mode. And I'm going to save this scene out as my ARM setup version 2 muscle rig. Right. So the first thing we need to do is we need to hide all the other muscle geometry except for the bicep, because that's going to be the first one that we're going to rig. And we will go through all the material properties, the solver properties, and all the nodes that you need to understand with Ziva to sort of get things started. This is going to be a very basic course, just to get you quickly up and running with creating a simulation with Ziva Dynamics. Before we get started, I'm going to run through some of these Ziva tools. So you have under the Ziva Tools tab, you have the Mesh Inspection, and there are 3 options in there called Run Mesh Analysis, Find Intersection, and Find Self-Intersection. These are super useful because you ideally want to keep your simulation geometry collision-free. So let's say if you want to check if there's a collision between your bicep and your humerus bone at the start of simulation, you can select your bicep and the humerus bone and click on Find Intersection. And ideally you should get a result where there is no intersection. But let's say if you had a bunch of vertices picked from here and they were colliding into the geometry, like so. If you run the Find Intersections command, it's going to highlight the faces on the polygons that are colliding with each other. So in our case, that looks pretty good. Find Self-Intersection looks for self-intersecting geometry. So let's say if I have these faces going through the back, it's going to isolate those polygonal faces for me. And Run Mesh Analysis generally just inspects the mesh to find strange topology or strange points with our stray vertices or any kind of issues that could cause a simulation to break down. So these 3 buttons are going to be a helper in designing your geometry to be the safest way for Ziva simulation. And if you don't follow these, very often you'll get errors in your script editor on creation, and that will also give you some feedback on if you need to fix the geometry. But for this exercise, I've cleaned up all the geometry that you have in this file, and I made sure they're all collision free, so we should be good to go. So let's get started with creating our first muscle. So we're going to select our bicep geometry, and we're going to go to the Ziva tab. So I'm going to bring this up here. And I'm going to create a Ziva tissue node. So as soon as you do that, you get a Ziva solver that's about 1 meter tall, and you get a bunch of tetrahedrons highlighted around the tissue geometry that you picked. And inside of that, you get a Z-TET node in your channel box, and you get a Z-tissue node. So the Z-tissue node holds all the tissue properties. If you want it to collide, if you want self-collision on, the stiffness of the collision when it interacts with, let's say, the bone geometry behind it, all of that can be set on our Z-tissue node. And you have also a bunch of different material properties. We're gonna stick with the default for now. And you have some dampening values and some pressure values underneath it. We won't deal with any of these right now. For the time being, the first thing we need to do is kind of deal with these TET sizes. By default, Ziva gives you a rather low TET size, but we might need a bit more to make this sort of simulate at a higher resolution. So the best way to do that is to drop your TET size. So currently it's at 13. We can try to drop it to 6. And you can see that the TET size is uniformly reduced to fit the geometry better. But suppose we want to have higher TET resolutions around the arms or the end sticking out of the bicep muscle. And we don't want an increased TET size right around the middle. Ziva provides you a paint tool that multiplies over the default TET size. So if you isolate the geometry in your scene and right click and go to paint Z-TET, you can now add TETs or a higher density of TETs to certain parts of your geometry. So if you paint some values here, like so, and then paint some additional values here. Now, if you get out of isolation, you can see that there are smaller TETs around those little arms that are sticking out. And the bicep in the middle has the default TET size based on the value you entered on your Z-TET node. Now, why this is really important is because Z-TETs really define how fast your simulation runs. And they also define how well your simulation runs. So being able to control areas of the geometry that needs more Z-TETs than other areas is really powerful, especially when it comes to, improving your simulation time. But so this looks pretty good. So we have a Ziva material node above this, which we're also going to keep at its default. There are some volume conservation values, some material properties, and some of the rest and pressure values that are here that we have to deal with in another step. But for the time being, for the muscle, we can leave all of these to default, and we can start simulating just to see what the default setup gives us. The first thing we need to do, of course, is make sure our playback speed is play every frame or play every frame max real time. And if you run the timeline, of course, our muscle falls down right now because we have gravity on and we don't have it attached to any of the bone geometry. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to actually scale this solver up to maybe 180, so it's a bit closer in size to our character. And let's run that again. So it's still going to drop through, which is great. So now we need to convert all our bone geometry into a Z bone node so we can attach the muscles to them. So the first thing we're going to do is I'm just going to isolate all the bone geometry in my scene. I'm going to drag select all of them. And I'm going to go to the Ziva tab and add the Ziva bone node. So as soon as I add that, there's a Z bone node now attached to this geometry. And it has some collision values that are set here, some collision stiffness values. And again, we're just going to leave this to default for now. But essentially, the bicep should be able to collide with our Ziva bone now. The last thing we want to do is we want to create some attachments to attach the muscle itself to the Ziva bone. So what we're going to do is we're going to isolate the bicep here. We're going to take some of just take some of these vertices and some of these ones right here. And then I'm going to select my scapular bone there. And I'm going to go on to Ziva and choose attachments. So the moment I create an attachment, you'll see the vertices around which the attachments are created get highlighted. And with both the bone and the muscle geo in your channel box, you should be able to find the new attachment that you created. The attachment has attachment modes. We will leave it at fixed for now, and I'll go through these as we continue our build. And we have the stiffness, which determines how tightly that attachment has to stay with the bone that you've linked it to. So now that you have an attachment, if you run through the simulation, and I'm just going to increase the timeline to maybe about 500 now. If you run it, you can see our tissue now being attached to our bone. That's great. If you select the solver, you can see that collision detection is currently switched off. I'm going to quickly go over the solver settings. The reason I scaled it up to from 100 to 180 is because I wanted the solver scale to match up with our character, who's considerably larger than the default characters Maya works with. So you can play around with these, but essentially you have a little indicator here of how tall the solver is. That's 1 meter. And based on that, you can use it to define how tall your character is. So I'm just going to stick with 150 for now. And over here, you have your collision detection and collision point spacing. So of course, we need this to be turned on for the simulation to evaluate properly, because we want the bicep to essentially collide with the bone geometry that we have. We're going to turn that on. Collision point spacing is essentially the number of collision points that are generated on simulation. And so the lower the number you set over here, the more dense the collision points are going to be. And we're going to play with this a little back and forth to give us the best result, because this really determines how fast your simulation runs as well. So we don't want to put this too low. We want to put it right around the amount that we need to kind of get the sim going. You have your substeps and max Newtonian iterations. So those are fairly straightforward. Substeps are just the number of frames or number of subframes that you're going to calculate the simulation. And the Newtonian iterations breaks that down further. So ideally, you want to have it set to maybe 2 or 4 subsets based on how much, based on the type of animation you're getting. The subsets also determines how much of the secondary animation comes through, because if you have the subset set to 1, you're going to lose some of the jiggle and some of the secondary animation. But if you have it set, let's say, to 8, you might be getting stuff that you don't really want, and also it's going to drastically increase your simulation time. You also have values like stiffness dampening that's going to help you dampen some of the secondary animation, so you don't get, let's say, a muscle jiggle that goes on from 2-3 frames longer than it should. And then, of course, you have your gravity values, and you have some visibility controls to show whether you see your Z-TET mesh in your viewport, or your bone geometry, or the type of attachments you have. That's the solver for the most part. And you have, of course, your FPS over here, and you have your start frame for the simulation. Great. So now we have our bicep, and we have collision turned on, so it should collide against the geometry in simulation. We need to create some additional attachments now, so I'm going to create an attachment to this bone, and possibly so to the radius, and possibly to the ulna as well, just to get the bicep to hang on to the arm better. So let's just select this area right here, maybe something like this. Select our bone and create a Ziva attachment there. Great. I'm going to do the same for this. this arm of the bicep. And I'm going to attach that one here as well. And we can play around with the attachment settings and maybe set them a bit lower so they're not as stiff from the start, and we can tighten them up as we go. So I'm going to reduce all the attachments to maybe about 10:6. Kind of happy with that. And let's just see how this simulates. All right. That looks pretty good. So the last thing we want is, of course, we want the biceps to stay on the arm and not fall down, sort of like this. And sort of having the additional muscles on the arm is going to help keep it there. But for the time being, because it's the start of our sim, we can create an additional attachment between the bicep and the humerus bone to keep it on that bone at all times. So what we're going to do is we're going to select a bicep geometry. We're going to select a bone geometry. And then under Ziva tools, we have this tool called the select vertice tool under the proximity tools. So you bring that option box up. You essentially have a value here. And based on the amount that you set on this value, you're going to be able to select vertices that are closest to the selection geometry that you picked from the muscle geo. So let's say you pick the muscle, then the bone, and you choose select. You can see that it picks a bunch of vertices that are close to that bone, right? So we needed more around this area. So I'm going to, again, select the muscle, then the bone, and I'm going to increase this value to, let's say, 0.5 and hit select. Still not enough for me. So let's do 1 instead. Perfect. So now you're getting the vertices down here to get highlighted. So I'm going to go to vertex mode. And then I'm just going to deselect the vertices over there. So I just get these ones. And then I'm going to select the bone and I'm going to create. Great. We got it. So now we have an attachment there. Now, by default, you can see it's again highlighted red because it's a fixed attachment. And that's going to keep the bicep in place. But as you can see, it makes it really stiff and quite uninteresting. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to change this attachment from a fixed into a sliding attachment. What a sliding attachment does is essentially keep the muscle geometry attached to the bone, but it allows the muscle geo to slide over the surface of the bone. So now if you hit playback, you can see that it keeps to the bone, but it slides basically through the surface of the geometry. And it's super useful for a muscle like a bicep, which needs to slide it up and down the humerus as it contracts and expands. So this looks pretty good to me. If you drop the sliding attachment to say, let's say 10:5, you can see it hangs off of the bone a bit better, but it still tries its best to keep its attachment through the surface of the geometry, but not have it stuck directly to the vertices you bound it to like a fixed attachment does. So this looks pretty good. The next thing we need to do is we need to create a muscle fiber node. So the muscle geometry for now has a Z material node, which dictates all its properties. And it has a few different attachments that connect it into our Z bone geo. But it still doesn't behave quite like a muscle. The primary requirement for a muscle is the fact that it has fibers, muscle fibers that run through it, and it can contract and expand based on the excitation it has in the animation. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to select our muscle geometry. We're going to Ziva, and we're going to add a muscle fiber node. The moment you create a muscle fiber node, you're going to get a Z fiber tab in your channel box with a lot of properties as well. You have properties like enable muscle growth, which is going to increase the size of the growth based on a value that you set in. And you're going to have the ability to use something called a line of action, which is the LOA for muscle growth. And we're going to talk about that in a bit. That essentially is a 2D curve that sits along the length of a muscle that can be bound to the bone geometry that's running underneath it. And you can use it to basically drive, or you can use it as a post reader to figure out if the muscle is contracting or expanding, and use the length of the curve to drive the excitation of the muscle. But for the time being, let's just play with this Z fiber node. So I'm going to create an animation for the excitation. So I'm going to set a key on the excitation at frame 1, and at frame 50, I'm going to turn it to 1. And another thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go into my Z solver, and I'm going to turn show Z TED off. And I'm also going to turn off the bone visibility and the attachments, collisions, and the material. So by default, what you'll be seeing is a bunch of these little red lines on your geometry. And those are the Z fiber nodes. And if you play through the simulation, you're going to see them turn red and the muscle sort of contract. And that's coming from this excitation animation that we created. That looks really good. Now, if you turn the enable muscle growth option on and play back, you can see that it doesn't change because we need to change the muscle growth scale to get an expansion or an increase in the volume. ZVAB by default is trying to preserve the volume while still contracting the muscle. But if we set this value, let's say to 2, there you go. So that's way too much. So maybe let's say 1.1 is something that we can live with. That looks pretty good. And just FYI, while you're building the tissue setup, and if your simulation isn't running as fast as you would like it to, the best thing you can do is turn off collision detection and keep your sub-steps fairly low, so you get some quick feedback. And when it's time to actually run collision, we can turn that back on. But while we're testing out our Ziva muscle properties, we don't really need to have collision turned on. Cool. So that looks pretty good. The next thing we're going to do is I'm going to go into that fiber node, and I'm going to break this connection, and we're going to create that 2D curve that we're going to use to drive the simulation. So the first thing we need to do is we need to select the geometry, and we're going to go to our Ziva tools, and we're going to use this option called create line of action curve. So when you do that, and let's bring our NURBS curves back on, you are going to get this curve that runs through the length of the muscle. And this one is going to be the thing that dictates if the muscle is shrinking or expanding based off of the length of the curve itself. The thing we need to do is we need to bind it to our bone geometry some way. So I have a rig in here, so I can easily bind it to the joints if I wanted to. But let's say you don't have a rig, then the easiest way might be to just create some rivets to attach it to. So I'm going to pick these two edges right here, and I'm just going to create a little rivet at the end of it. And I'm going to create the next one on my radius bone right around here. Perfect. And now what I can do is I can create a cluster to drive the length of the curve. And I can parent the cluster under my rivet. Now, if I fold my arm, that curve is going to get smaller, and that's going to let the bicep know it needs to contract. So for the time being, let's just switch to FK mode, and I'm just going to create a little animation on the arm. So I'm going to set a keyframe at frame 1, and then at frame 50, let's just fold it by about that much. Great. And then what we're going to do is we're going to select the muscle geometry, control select the curve, and under Ziva, we're going to create a muscle line of action. So as soon as you create that, under the Z fiber nodes, if you pick the Z fiber node from your channel box and select that, you have a line of action node now created next to it. So we definitely want to use line of action for our muscle growth. And then we have the position sensitivity value, which we can tweak to gauge how much the muscles should excite when contracting. So for the time being, let's just select that Z line of action node and let's run the simulation. So another thing you can do is if you pick the Z solver and you add a Ziva cache node, we can now cache the simulation quite quickly. And once you've cached it, you can scrub on the timeline. This is super useful to gauge how our setup is working. So by default, a bicep contracts by about that much based off the line of action curve. Great. I'm going to create another animation here. So let's say at frame 50, I set a key, and at frame 100, I'm just going to twist the forearm like this. Now, once I have a cache node, I might have to clear it every time I make a change in the scene. Clear that, and then let's run the simulation again. So that's how much it's contracting by. Now, the tendons that are sticking out of the ends of the muscle, you can see they're kind of soft right now. We can add different material properties to get them to be a bit more stiff. So let's say if the arm below here, or the tendons below here, I want to make them considerably stiffer so the bicep, so this acts more like a rigid object that's pushing a bunch of soft tissue above it. What you can do is you can create an additional Ziva material node, right? So now you get an extra material node. If you go to paint and then go to Ziva materials, you can see that it's painted everywhere in the geometry. What I'm going to do is I'm going to select all of these. Maybe just like those. And then I'm going to paint out that new material over there. You can even soften the influence a little bit. And then this new material node, we can make it a lot stiffer, and we can see what that does to our simulation. All right, that's looking pretty good. And another thing I really don't like is sort of the shape of this muscle and how long these tendons stick out. I don't know if it's really necessary to have it that long. But for the time being, I'm just going to leave it as is, and it's kind of cool to see our bicep working. Cool. So let's go back to a Z solver and bring on our TETs in our viewport so we can see everything. Perfect. All right. That looks pretty good.